Oh, welcome back, choir. It feels so good. So lovely to see you in your blue robes and to hear the music and to hear your voices as well. What a joy. According to the game of chess, the king is the most important piece, allowed to move one square in any direction, either orthogonally, isn't that a nice word? Orthogonally or diagonally. If your king is threatened with capture, it is said to be in, anyone? Check, right, well done. And if your king cannot escape capture, then the game is over and you say, somebody else says to you, checkmate. Checkmate, well done, chess players. Checkmate means what? You lose. The game is over, king's been captured, you've lost. So here's a real question for you this morning, and I welcome any, responses that you might share with me. Do you think that Jesus would be good at the game of chess? Have you not ever thought about that? Do you think Jesus would be a good chess player? I mean, on the one hand, he is divine wisdom personified. He doesn't miss any of the angles going on around him. He sees what's happening all the time. He's very perceptive. He might be very good at chess. On the other hand, though, he doesn't really abide by the kinds of rules that means half the players are going to go down and half the players are going to win, does he? He doesn't really abide by those kinds of rigid rules and roles of games. For example, we know that because in the gospel text this morning, James and John, who've been following him, they're brothers, James and John, they're playing by the rules of the game in their context, as they are seeking to gain some status in this new movement that Jesus is leading. They are learning what he says, they're going along with it, they believe in Jesus, and because they so believe in what Jesus is doing, they seek to climb the ladder of the Jesus movement and secure positions of influence and power within it. Doesn't make them bad guys. It's pretty natural. They ask Jesus to position them in the very back row of the chessboard, if you will, right on the right and left side of the king. And Jesus says to them, and I'm going to say these words to you leaving two words in the original Greek so that we hear them new. We hear them differently. I will tell you what they mean if you don't know. It's not a pop quiz. So this is what Jesus says to James and John. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your diakonos. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be doulos of all. Diakonos, doulos. Diakonos. Let's start with that word. Does anybody know what diakonos means? Any idea of what? Do you know what that means, Amy?
I do. It means servant. And most importantly, a servant who acts at the command of another.
Thank you. Now, she did this already at 8 o'clock, but I didn't really prep her for it because she's a deacon. She has taken ordination vows to serve at the behest of another, the bishop. She is committed to service ministry. She's a deacon, so of course she knows diakonos. Ed is also a deacon. We've got other deacons here. Diakonos means servant. And yet, while some have taken ordination vows, all are called to deacon. Jesus is calling us into a ministry characterized by this word diakonos, which is an intermediary servant person acting and speaking for a superior. In the early Christian church, deacons were definitely working right for the bishop every day. overseeing the distribution of charity in the community of believers for any who were in need, and also beyond the community of believers to those in need beyond. The serving work of deacons in the early church, we know this from ancient accounts, reminded those ancient followers of Jesus of the activity of angels. When you were visited by a deacon, you felt like angels had come through. Isn't that wonderful? And we are called to be those angels, those deacons in our activities with one another. Deacons were and are sacred messengers of good news, agents of this Jesus way of love. You might have been distracted if you got here early, or I'm going to distract you now. This little bulletin insert was written by me, so you're getting lots of messages from me this morning. This is about a time in my life when an angel appeared as a diakonos in a moment of need. You can read it later, because I'm going to get back to the sermon, but you can set it aside. That's one experience out of so many in my life where I have been ministered to, and it felt like the activity of angels. Diakonos. The other word I left in the original Greek was doulos. Doulos. Any ideas how we might translate that? Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure it means
Slave, absolutely, because that's what it says in our printed text. I like how you figured that out, if that's how you did it. So slave, also, we often hear it as last. You know, the idea of being last of all, slave to all. In the original, the word doulos is like the word slave in that it's a noun and it's an actual position or role in the community. A doulos, it's a little bit different than slave though in its original Greek. Doulos is really the job typically of a woman in ancient Rome. I can't imagine it wasn't a woman in any of these positions, but I didn't research that to be sure. But in ancient Rome, the doulos were the people who were women employed to provide guidance to another woman in childbirth. It's a woman's role, and also to stick around and support the new parents, especially as they have their first baby. So the doula was the name given to those attending births, bringing life into the world. They had wisdom from many, many other childbirth experiences they could share, so that the home in that moment would be a place of peace and contentment and joy. Jesus is teaching James and John with these words, diakonos and doulos, that there's a whole new strategy at play. That this is not like the game of chess, where we elbow one another, knock over pieces, and say, checkmate at the end. That's not what this is. It's not a game. It's a way of life. And Jesus teaches James and John that it has a different kind of strategy involved. It has new positions where the strategy is service and bringing life into the world. I can imagine that later they talked to each other, these two brothers, and shook their heads a little bit and said, you know, that's not exactly what we had in mind. What are you going to do? They stayed with it. They stayed with it, to their credit. Instead of king down, game over, like in chess, for the Jesus followers then and now, when the king goes down, the game really begins. The real activity begins. We follow a king who voluntarily becomes a deacon, a doula, to guide us into resurrected life, to guide us into ways of being reborn in the Spirit so that we will live forever. There is no checkmate for the Christian believer. The game never ends. We are with Jesus forever. The King of Kings says to the ancient world and to our world, hey friends, this game is rigged. This game is rigged, and then strategically, with his own body, flips the game by voluntarily dying, reversing his status and being willing to pay the price, not only for all those pieces on his side of the chessboard, he dies for every piece that is playing both sides of the chessboard. When Jesus died on the cross, it opened a better way, not a game, a real way, a pathway toward life and love and peace and justice for us. It opened us a way of being angels for one another. We are called to constantly strategize with Jesus, to flip over those games of this world that people play on a grand or small scale. Well, it's really fun, and there's nothing wrong with playing chess and other games of strategy with other people, or now on the computer, especially during COVID. Millions of people learn to play chess on the computer with each other. And while it's fun to play these games of strategy, in our actual life, we must be on guard against falling into those larger games that society plays, in which certain pieces on the board matter more than the other pieces, in which certain positions have power over the lives of others and fail to serve them faithfully, in which our own desire for status might cause us to elbow and knock one another over. We must be on guard. For Jesus followers, salvation comes when his status is totally reversed, totally flipped. Greatness comes through humility, through claiming the power of diakonos and doulos. Deacons and doulas, serving and assisting, coaching and encouraging, making sacrifices for one another, seeking the good of the community over any desire for our own status. Now, it's really hard to live in this flipped way, isn't it? It's challenging. The culture around us, sometimes even in the guise of Christian values, might beckon us to play by the rules of another game that is not the way of Jesus. We must be vigilant. It's challenging. Sometimes it's confusing to know if we're playing two games at once, if we're following in the way of Jesus but still playing by the rules of the world, or if we are deceiving ourselves into thinking that we are following Jesus faithfully when we are in fact enriching ourselves or gaining in status and being more faithful to institutions and economies and corporations that look nice and seem nice and maybe even feel nice to be a member of, while perhaps also contributing to things that harm other people. And so alongside this really challenging and somewhat confusing way of life following Jesus, we have some practices, some things that we can do to shape our lives to be more and more like Jesus and less like that status-seeking way that Drew and James and John in the text. More and more into deacons and doulas instead of playing the parts of kings and pawns. A few of these practices are prayer, forgiveness, and charity. Prayer. We've got lots of definitions out there for prayer, but the one I want to offer you this morning is this act of acknowledging from time to time or on a regular basis, acknowledging that we are not the center of the world. We are not the center of the universe. And we pause, and we do that by turning our hearts, our minds, maybe our words towards God and saying, help! Anyone pray that prayer? I prayed it this week sitting on 70 for an hour and a half with the car off, watching emergency vehicles coming down, about 20 cars ahead of me, addressing whatever was going on. You don't know what's happening, but you see a helicopter coming down and assume it's headed to shock trauma. And the whole time you're thinking, help the emergency workers, Lord. Help whoever's in these vehicles. Help their families. Help the doctors that will receive them. All the hospital workers at shock trauma. Help. You don't need to know names. You don't need to know what unfolded. Just help. How about this prayer? Have you ever prayed the prayer that goes like this? Thanks. You ever prayed that prayer? Gosh, in the morning when the sun is coming up and you have the opportunity to see it, maybe with the warm cup of coffee in your hands on a crisp fall morning like this, you might look around at your life and notice at least one thing that you can be so thankful for and just say to God, thanks. That's a prayer. Here's another one. Wow. That was my prayer yesterday after the wind and the rain went away. And then did you see the sky? Oh my goodness, it was like a painting and I was standing in it. And it was moving so quickly. I just said, wow, that's a prayer. In fact, Help, Thanks, Wow is the title of a book on prayer by Anne Lamott that I highly recommend. It's a very good way to understand how prayer functions. By turning to God in prayer, whether we're saying help or thanks or wow or one of the beautiful prayers in the prayer book or something else that is lifted from our hearts in a particular moment, we are acknowledging that God is trustworthy and in charge. And that reminds us that we are not playing the games of this world. We are oriented to God's way. Another practice that helps us get out of that knocking each other over way of life and move into the Jesus way of life is called forgiveness. And I think you've all heard of it before. We pray about it in the Lord's Prayer. Forgiveness. I'm going to add forbearance on there as well because it's an underutilized word that is really powerful for Christian people. One way to know that you are following Jesus and not playing that other game of the world is to be constantly doing the hard and freeing work of forgiving and forbearing. Forgiving requires us to release ourselves from making demands on the behaviors of other people or of ourselves in the past, to experience freedom and peace as we learn the lessons of the past and move forward, wiser and free. Forbearance, that's a great word, requires us to live this life in ways that are gentle, with some self-control, some restraint and tolerance for others, even when they seem to want to knock over our pieces on the board or behave in ways that violate our values. That's especially the moment in which we need forbearance. Forgiveness and forbearance are signs to us as we do them that we are doing the work to flip over the game like Jesus did. When we forgive and forbear, we are learning to live more and more like Jesus. The third practice I'm offering this morning as a way to move into the Jesus way is charity. Another word we know, we might have different definitions of. There is a longing in us to serve and assist one another in real material ways, to do those activities that are like ministering as the angels do. We care so much about being deacons, diakonos in this world and bringing about new life for one another that we go so far as to contribute a portion of our own earnings and our time and our skillfulness to other people, to flipping the game entirely and bringing about the Jesus way in fullness. And we dislodge our own death grip on our status-seeking urges, and instead we open our hands and we offer ourselves, even our earnings, to one another, especially in those areas where we sense there is great need. 2020 will be remembered in the history books for many things. One of them will be, I hope, a spike in generosity. Philanthropic giving was up nationally by 3.8% in 2020, from all-time records on charitable giving patterns. Yes, even when you adjust for inflation, if you were worried about that. 3.8%, that's quite an increase in generosity. Physically isolated, struggling through all the changes and pivots and another contentious election cycle in 2020. People out in the streets, some of us out there in the streets protesting racial injustice. Some of us at home watching these protests on the evening news, afraid, with a lot of unease about it. While all of that was happening and more, people gave more money than ever before to causes that they believed would deacon one another, would doula new ways of life into being. People were being angels for one another. So friends, let us strategically flip the games that do not deacon and doula and transform them into ways of life. Through prayer and forgiveness and generous giving, let us bring life. Let us bring to life new ways of ordering our own lives and relationships. We are all called to be deacons and doulas, called to serve and bring life into this world so that those around us may find themselves drawn into that love of Jesus, the King who willingly went down for every player on the board, that the game might be revamped and reworked into a more life-giving way characterized by hearts and homes and whole communities brimming with peace and joy and understanding.